Let me ask you a question that might make you uncomfortable. Does a mother with 2 children waiting at home have the right to play a game of Russian roulette at an altitude of 8,000 meters? Back in 1995, the world was torn apart by this very debate when the legendary climber Alison Hargreaves lost her life on the brutal, unforgiving slopes of K2. The media didn't hold back. They painted her as selfish, branding her as a negligent mother who abandoned her family just to chase a selfish dopamine hit. But fast forward 24 years and the story took a darker turn. Another killer peak. Nanga Parbat claimed the life of her son Tom Ballard. It sounds like the script of a mystical family curse, but the truth is far more grounded and honestly much more brutal. So what was the force that pulled them toward the death zone? Why did this intense love affair with the high peaks end in such a devastating double tragedy? Let's dig into the past. Picture a 9-year-old girl standing completely alone on the side of a massive Scottish mountain, 150 meters down the slope. Her parents, both logical calculating mathematicians, are slowly inching their way up. They can't see her. But here's the thing, she isn't crying. She isn't screaming for help. She is just standing there, waiting. She possesses a level of calm that is both terrifying and deeply impressive for a child. That little girl is Alison Hargreaves. That day on Ben Nevis was just the opening scene of a life that defied explanation. She grew up in Derbyshire, raised in a household where logic and numbers were the ultimate authority. Her parents were brilliant minds. For them, a holiday wasn't about relaxing by the pool or building sandcastles. It was about executing meticulously planned routes through the rugged hills of England and Scotland. It was a very intellectual, structured way to experience the outdoors. But even then, Alison felt a void. Something essential was missing from these calculated hikes. She didn't just want to walk, she craved altitude, real dizzying altitude. The light bulb moment happened when she was 13 years old. Her school rolled out a new extracurricular activity, rock climbing. Her teacher, a woman named Hilary Boardman, opened the door to a vertical world of sheer walls, tiny handholds, and safety ropes. For Alison, this wasn't just a sport, it was a spiritual awakening. She had finally discovered a way to channel her restless energy and her hidden aggression into something productive. It didn't require brute strength. It demanded laser-focused attention and mental gymnastics. Climbing became her language, her primary way of interacting with the universe. From that split second on, her life had changed forever. By the time she hit 14, she wasn't just interested. She was completely obsessed. Every single weekend and every school break was dedicated to hunting down new rock faces to conquer. She traveled across every corner of Britain, sharpening her skills and building her physical resilience. She sounded like a broken record to her friends. I just need to be climbing, all the time. This had evolved way past a hobby. It was a physiological need as vital to her survival as oxygen. Then came her 18th birthday. She crushed her final exams. The gates to Oxford University were wide open. This was her parents' ultimate dream, the logical progression for a family of intellectuals. But Alison wasn't staring at textbooks or career blueprints. She was gazing upward toward the horizon where the skyline was shattered by jagged mountain peaks. And she made a choice that shocked everyone. She rejected Oxford. She walked away from a guaranteed prestigious career path without blinking. This was her first true rebellion, a profound break from the carefully constructed world her parents had built for her. She chose the chaotic, dangerous, and vertical existence of a professional mountaineer. She didn't just drift away from her past, she severed the ties completely and absolutely. Immediately following her 18th birthday, Alison packed her life into a bag and left. She moved in with a man who viewed her obsession not as teenage rebellion, but as a divine calling. His name was Jim Ballard. He was nearly double her age, ran a small climbing equipment shop, and was a climber himself, though he never reached the professional level. In this young, fiercely driven woman, Jim sees something extraordinary. He doesn't just see talent, he sees a raw, unpolished diamond. And he decides right then and there that he will be the one to cut and polish it. He becomes the center of her universe, her romantic partner, her athletic coach, her business manager, and the master tactician behind her rise. Their relationship goes far deeper than a typical romance. It's a business merger with the future of elite climbing hanging in the balance. Jim positions himself as the architect of her destiny. They even launch a business together, an outdoor gear store. But let's be honest, that was just the storefront, because the real operation is happening behind the scenes. While Allison is out there pushing her body to the brink of collapse, Jim is obsessively crafting what we would today call her personal brand. He is getting her name in the headlines, securing corporate sponsors, and mapping out dangerous expeditions. He is constructing the myth of Allison Hargreaves, while Allison does the dirty work of forging a body strong enough to carry that legend. Her workday isn't in a cubicle. It starts on the wet green hills of Derbyshire at the crack of dawn, regardless of the forecast. Every single morning, she commits to a grueling 2-hour run. This isn't just cardio, it's a form of moving meditation, a method to harden not just her legs, but her mind. She is transforming her physical form into a precision instrument designed to survive the crushing pressure of the death zone. This repetitive, daily grind, it is the steep tax she pays for the privilege of viewing the world from heights the rest of us will only ever see in documentaries. Together, they are building more than a resume. They are constructing a philosophy. Allison adopts a mantra that becomes her code, her defining signature. It was a line Jim loved to quote to describe her spirit. "It is better to live one day as a tiger than 1,000 years as a sheep." And realize this wasn't just a catchy sticker for a bumper. This was the master key to unlocking her psychology. It was about rejecting the safe paved road in exchange for a single blinding moment of glory at the top of the world. And that philosophy, born in the quiet hills of England, was about to face its ultimate exam in the frozen lethal heart of the planet, the Himalayas, because a tiger needs a jungle worthy of its stripes. At the age of 24, Allison receives the golden ticket that shifts her entire trajectory. She gets invited to join an expedition led by Jeff Lowe, a titan of American climbing. The target is Kangtega, a terrifying peak in Nepal that towers nearly 7,000 meters into the sky. This isn't some local practice wall where you slip, the rope catches you, and you laugh about it over a beer. This is the major leagues. This is a hostile environment where a single miscalculation ends in a funeral. On May 1st, 1986, she stands at the base of the biggest challenge of her life. Alongside her climbing partner, Mark Twight, she begins the assault on the northwest face. This isn't a slope. It's a vertical nightmare of brittle ice and rock, sharp enough to slice skin. Every handhold is a roll of the dice, and every foot of elevation is a violent struggle against gravity and bone-deep cold. But they pull it off. They carve a brand new route up the mountain where no human had ever dared to go. In that moment, Allison Hargreaves cements her place in history as the first British woman to reach that summit. Back in the UK, the newspapers go wild. It's a massive victory. But for Allison, the story is just starting. Lowe and Twight, her now famous climbing partners, pack up to chase another peak. Allison stays behind at base camp. You would think she'd be satisfied, ready to go home and play the hero. But that hunger is still gnawing at her. She has zero intention of resting on her victory. She immediately aims higher. She teams up with a Scotsman named Sandy Allen, and their target is borderline insane, the 8,000er Lhotse Shar. This is an entirely different beast. The altitude is crushing, and the rules of survival change completely. They claw their way up to 6,500 meters. The air is getting dangerously thin. Every single movement requires a titanic amount of willpower. But the lack of oxygen isn't the primary threat. The mountain starts talking to them. A deep, guttural rumble echoes. Avalanches begin to break loose above. Lhotse Shar is sending a very clear message. You are not passing today. For the first time in her career, Allison stares directly into the face of nature's absolute power, a force you cannot negotiate with. It is her first brutal education in the death zone. Sometimes the only way to win is to turn around. You have to retreat if you want to live to climb another day. This failure shapes her character more than any summit ever could. The retreat from Lhotse becomes a pivot point. She realized mountains could be more than just a trophy. They could be a sanctuary. But beneath the shiny surface of this perfect athletic partnership, underneath the glory lies a dark and twisted reality. A reality that was secretly captured in the pages of her private diary. In 1987, she writes an entry that makes your blood run cold. Jim unleashed his anger again, shoving me down into the snow. The image of the perfect couple begins to shatter, revealing the complex, painful truth of their dynamic where support was inextricably linked with control. And perhaps that is the reason why, just a year later, she commits to the most audacious and controversial move of her entire life. She decides to tackle the north face of the Eiger. And she's going to do it solo. The legendary Murder Wall, a vertical maze of crumbling rock and ice that had already killed dozens of elite climbers. But there is one specific detail that takes this from brave to almost unthinkable. Allison is 6 months pregnant. She is attempting this climb while carrying a new life, balancing on a knife edge with a heavy pack on her back. And while she survives the climb, she gets hit by a different kind of avalanche, a media storm. The press erupts. Journalists attack her, calling her reckless, accusing her of prioritizing her ego over the life of her unborn child. Her reputation is dragged through the dirt on the front pages, transforming her from a national hero into a monster. But Allison, hardened by the mountains, refuses to break. She fires back with a statement that becomes legendary. A sharp, defiant line, delivered with absolute dignity. "I was pregnant, not an invalid." Shortly after coming down from the mountain, she gives birth to a son, Tom, a boy who had technically climbed the murder wall before he even took his first breath. In that moment, it seemed she had defeated everything, the mountain, the critics, and the limitations placed on her gender. However, the adrenaline high of conquering the rock and winning over the public evaporates the moment she faces the harsh reality waiting back home. Just 1 year later, a frantic, heartbreaking entry in her diary reveals more about her mental state than any glossy magazine profile ever could. "I have nowhere else to go." The hero who had tamed the Eiger was no longer free. She was cornered, trapped in a life that was rapidly running out of options. The trap she described in those private pages was about to slam shut with devastating force. As the early 1990s rolled in the stable existence they had meticulously constructed began to disintegrate around them, Jim's business, a climbing gear shop, that served as the financial bedrock for their family and the funding source for Allison's career, was crumbling into dust. The economic recession was ruthless, sparing absolutely no one in its path. Before long, the debt collectors came calling and they lost their house. The walls that were supposed to be their sanctuary and fortress were suddenly repossessed. Their new address was a battered, second-hand van. This rusting metal box was now the cramped universe for a family of 4, including 2 very young children. The most talented female climber of her generation was forced to trade the comfort of a warm bedroom for a cold sleeping bag and a vehicle that barely ran. The mountains, which had always been her passion, and her unique way of communicating with the world transformed into something else entirely her only lifeline. Their entire existence had shrunk down to the claustrophobic confines of that van. Climbing was no longer just an escape. It was their only ticket out of this financial hell. It was a terrifying shift in perspective. Her raw talent, her list of broken records, and her reputation were the only liquid assets the family had left. Her physical body, her iron will, and her capacity to suffer through freezing temperatures and exhaustion became the only currency they could trade for survival. Every ascent ceased to be merely an athletic challenge or a personal goal. It became an all-or-nothing gamble with high stakes. Jim stepped back into the role of her manager, but the dynamic had shifted darker. He wasn't just building a brand anymore, he was fighting to keep his family off the streets. There was absolutely no margin for error. One slip meant total ruin. Backing down from a route during the expeditions of 1994 or 95 wasn't just a bruised ego or a missed sporting opportunity. It was a financial catastrophe. A failed climb meant the sponsorship checks would stop clearing and there were no backups. It meant the van might run dry on diesel, and worse, the children might go to sleep hungry. The mountain transformed in her eyes. It was no longer just a pile of rock and ice. It was her employer, her merciless creditor, and her judge, all wrapped into one towering figure. The price of failure was no longer measured in meters fallen or frostbite suffered, but in the bleak future of her children and the collapse of her family unit. Under this crushing, monstrous pressure, the most audacious project of her entire career began to take shape. In the summer of 1993, she decided to throw down the gauntlet. She wasn't just challenging a single peak, she was challenging the entire history of alpinism and every convention in the book. She unveiled a plan so bold it bordered on insanity to become the first person in history to solo climb the 6 great north faces of the Alps in a single season. The Eiger, the Matterhorn, the Grandes Jorasses. These weren't just geographical features, they were legends. These were names that struck fear into the hearts of veterans, and she intended to conquer them all one after another in a relentless blitz. Their battered old van was converted into a mobile command center. While Jim managed the logistics and took care of the kids, Allison went to work on the rock. They became nomads drifting from one campsite to another at the feet of the giants in France, Switzerland, and Italy. As soon as one mountain range was behind them, the next one loomed ahead. One assault immediately followed another. The rhythm was grueling. She would climb, a deadly face to send back to Earth. The family would pack up their meager belongings, drive to the next location, and start the cycle all over again. It was a conveyor belt of extreme risk, bone-deep exhaustion, and unimaginable stress. Yet she delivered. Face after face, summit after summit, she ticked them off. Her speed was nothing short of miraculous. If you were to tally up the actual time she spent clinging to the rock and ice during that entire campaign, it totaled less than one single day. She had written her name into the history books in less than 24 hours of cumulative climbing time. This went beyond mere mountaineering. It was a display of high-performance athleticism that the climbing world had rarely seen. However, the climbing community she so desperately wanted to impress offered her a freezing cold reception. The French press in particular was vicious. Journalists and so-called experts began to dissect her climbs, placing every move under a microscope. The whispers started circulating, criticizing her choice of routes. They claimed the line she took up the Grande Jurasse and her path on the Eiger lacked integrity. They sneered that her routes were too easy for such a groundbreaking record, dismissing the danger involved. Instead of the thunderous applause and triumph she deserved, she was met with a tidal wave of bitter criticism. Her incredible physical achievement was completely dismissed, reduced to a petty argument over technicalities and route selection. But the most devastating financial blow was still on the horizon. The book she wrote detailing that insane summer, titled A Hard Day's Summer, failed miserably to find an audience. It simply didn't sell. The royalty checks they were counting on to save them never arrived. The greatest feat in the history of alpinism did absolutely nothing to solve their crushing debt. The van remained their home. Allison was forced to confront the harsh truth that even conquering 6 of the world's deadliest giants wasn't enough to buy her family a normal life. The rejection from the climbing elite and the unsold books on the shelves were a massive blow to her pride, but they failed to break her spirit. In fact, the criticism acted like high-octane fuel for her ambition. She was hurt, certainly, but more than that, she was angry. She decided to clap back. She wouldn't do it with defensive words in a magazine interview, but with undeniable action. If the world doubted her strength, she would demonstrate a level of power that was impossible to ignore or deny. She returned to the Alps that very same autumn, refusing to lick her wounds. This time, the narrative would be different. She raised the stakes to the absolute limit. She returned to the Grande Jurasse, the very mountain the critics claimed she had climbed too easily. But this time, she wasn't looking for the path of least resistance. She set her sights on the Crow's Spur, one of the most notorious, difficult, and dangerous lines on the entire face. And she chose to do it in November, in winter. She was entering the arena when the mountain becomes a frozen hellscape, where every vertical foot is a violent battle for survival. This was no longer a sporting event. This was a direct, uncompromising middle finger to every single one of her critics. She knew that simply climbing the route wouldn't be enough for the skeptics. She needed irrefutable proof. To eliminate any shadow of a doubt, to silence any accusation of cheating, her sponsors arranged for a professional photographer to be there. A dedicated photographer tracked her progress up the icy face, capturing every agonizing move. Now the audience wasn't just her family watching anxiously from the van. It was the unblinking lens of a camera there to document her ultimate triumph or her tragic failure. On November 10th, she launched her assault. The face in winter was a completely different beast than in summer. The ice was brittle and unpredictable. The rock was glazed with a treacherous layer of verglas, and the temperatures were plummeting well below freezing. Yet Allison moved with a speed and precision that defied logic. She scaled the entire face in a single day. In conditions where most hardened climbers wouldn't dare unzip their tents, she pulled off a lightning-fast ascent. It was a dazzling display of absolute technical mastery, physical endurance, and an iron will. This time, the detractors had nothing to say. The critics fell silent. There were no more debates about purity of style, no more snide questions about her skill level. This climb wasn't just a success, it was her coronation. No one dared to question her rightful place at the absolute pinnacle of the mountaineering world. She had proven everything she needed to prove. But tragically, this triumph, just like the previous one, didn't fill their bank account. It only brought her a name, a famous name that everyone now recognized, but fame doesn't pay for groceries. That name, the one on everyone's lips, was about to be broadcast from the highest stage on Earth. She set her sights on the ultimate prize, the holy grail that every great mountaineer dreams of: Everest. In 1994, she traveled to Nepal. Her goal was simple and terrifying: to stand on top of the world. She tackled the classic route from the south side, joining a British expedition. But waiting for her at base camp was something more precious than glory or sponsors. It was her 2 young children, Tom and Kate. There was a poignant image of her 6-year-old son pushing his toy cars through the dirt in the shadow of the world's highest peak, while his mother prepared to enter the death zone. That single image conveyed more than 1,000 words ever could about the stakes she was playing for. She climbed with a quiet confidence, her body acclimatizing smoothly to the thin air. Step by grueling step, she pushed higher, navigating the treacherous, shifting blocks of the Khumbu icefall and scaling the sheer, icy face of Lhotse. She finally reached the South Col, the desolate, windswept plateau that serves as the final launching pad for the summit. This was Camp 4, sitting at an altitude of 8,400 meters. There were just 450 vertical meters separating her from the top. Victory was so close she could practically feel it. The air was frigid and dangerously thin. Every single breath was a desperate struggle for oxygen, but she felt strong, mentally ready for that final brutal push. And then her body sounded a sudden alarm. It started innocently enough, with a slight tingling in her fingertips, but that tingling quickly deepened into a terrifying numbness. She was losing all sensation in the tips of her fingers and toes. With her vast experience, Allison knew instantly what was happening. This wasn't just the ambient cold, it was the first warning sign of severe frostbite. It was the precursor to necrosis, the point where your own body tissue begins to die and rot. The summit was beckoning just a few short hours away, but a voice of reason, cold and clear as the Himalayan wind, cut through her ambition. She made the hardest decision of her entire career. She turned around, with the summit within absolute touching distance, with every fiber of her being screaming, "Keep going." She forced herself to say no. This decision wasn't an act of weakness or fear. It was the ultimate display of professional discipline. She would later explain her choice with a disarming, pragmatic simplicity. "I felt great, but I wasn't prepared to lose my fingers." She chose her future over the moment. She chose the ability to hold a rope, to write in her journal, and to live a functional life over a fleeting moment of glory. She chose the certainty of hugging her children again with warm hands rather than paying a gruesome price for a summit that would end her career. She descended back down to her son and his toy cars, proving that sometimes the greatest victory is knowing when to retreat. But for a climber like Allison, retreat is not surrender. It simply means regrouping to come back twice as strong. In the spring of 1995, she returned to the Himalayas, but this was a different Allison, armed with a radically different plan. This time she approached Everest not from the commercial south, but from the north, the remote Tibetan side. And she was changing the rules of the game completely. She was giving up supplemental oxygen. There would be no help from Sherpas above base camp. She was going for the summit in the purest, most uncompromising, and exponentially most dangerous style known to man. This was no longer just a climb for a paycheck. It was a philosophical statement about human potential and the purity of the endeavor. Her entire existence has been compressed into a single heavy rucksack. Inside that nylon shell lies a tent, a sleeping bag, and a stove, the only things standing between her and oblivion. She operates as a self-contained unit, her own porter, her own cook, and her own one-woman rescue team. She hauls her gear up the icy slopes to establish high-altitude camps in a frozen void where a single misstep guarantees a fatal fall. Her dedication to this brutal, self-sufficient style is nothing short of fanatical. She guards the purity of her unsupported status with an almost religious fervor. When climbers from rival expeditions offer her a simple cup of hot tea in the warmth of their tents, she politely but firmly refuses. Accepting it would taint her record. She stands completely alone, a solitary figure, pitting her will against the sheer indifferent mass of the greatest mountain on Earth. The ascent is a slow, agonizing war of attrition against thin air and crushing isolation. Each camp she sets up is a tiny, fragile island of life in a landscape of death. Every step she takes upward is a hard-fought victory over a body that is screaming in protest, lungs burning and muscles trembling with fatigue. Yet despite the physical torture, she refuses to yield. Then on May 13, 1995, the struggle culminates in glory. She takes the final heavy step and finds herself standing on the roof of the world. There is no one else there. The silence is profound, broken only by the whistling of the wind through the peaks. She has become the first woman in history to conquer Everest solo and without supplemental oxygen, an absolute triumph of human endurance. It is a moment that guarantees her immortality in the annals of mountaineering history. Standing at the highest point on the planet, she unclips her radio. But her first message isn't a boast to the press or a thank you to corporate sponsors. Her words bypass the waiting world and travel thousands of miles to a small van reaching out to the only people who truly matter. Her voice crackles over the static. To Tom and Kate, I am on top of the world and I love them very much. Over. As the world down below erupts in applause, crowning Allison Hargreaves, the new queen of the Himalayas, she is already moving on. She doesn't linger to enjoy the acclaim. Her ambition is relentless. The plan is to bag the 3 highest peaks on Earth in a single year. With Everest conquered, K2 and Kangchenjunga are next on her hit list. She wastes no time flying straight from Nepal to the rugged terrain of Pakistan. She marches to the foot of K2, known darkly as the Savage Mountain. But unlike Everest, K2 does not welcome her. It greets her with a cold, stony silence and a season of weather that threatens to end her streak before it begins. The climbing season of 1995 proves to be a nightmare. The mountain shrouds itself in deep, unstable snow and is battered by a relentless parade of storms. Days bleed into weeks, and weeks drag into months of agonizing stagnation at base camp. June fades into July, and the weather gods offer no mercy, not a single viable window to launch a summit bid. As the wait drags on, the atmosphere in base camp turns toxic. These climbers are high-energy individuals fueled by ambition, now trapped in a freezing prison of white. Inevitably, the stress takes its toll. Partnerships begin to crumble under the pressure. Her own climbing partner, the man she had strategized with for months, finally snaps. He can't handle the endless waiting game any longer. Desperate to move, he joins another team that decides to gamble on a marginal weather opening. Allison is left behind, effectively abandoned. She is now isolated in a crowded camp surrounded by dozens of strangers, but lacking a partner she can trust with her life. The clock is ticking, the season is dying, and she is drifting in limbo. By the time early August rolls around, the mountain has broken the spirit of most expeditions. Tents are struck, gear is packed, and teams retreat down the valley, admitting defeat. A heavy silence falls over the base camp as it empties out. Only the most stubborn, the most obsessed climbers remain. In this oppressive quiet, Allison is forced to have the hardest conversation of all with herself. Her diary becomes a repository for her darkest thoughts and fears. The pages fill with lines of anguish. She writes about feeling torn apart at the seams. On one side, there is the burning obsession to finish what she started to conquer, this unyielding monster of rock and ice. She cannot bear the thought of leaving empty-handed. On the other side is a visceral, unbearable ache for her children, for Tom and Kate, who are waiting for their mother halfway across the world. The mountain demands total, undivided focus, but her heart is being pulled back to safety. Finally, something within her shifts. The internal war ends. She makes a life-altering decision. She approaches the Spanish team, the only other group crazy enough to stay, and confides in them. She tells them that after K2, she is finished. No Kangchenjunga, no more chasing records. She is going home. Her new dream isn't a mountain peak, but a sandy beach where she can build castles with her kids and be a mother again. The vision of that beach has eclipsed the glory of the world's 3rd highest peak. But she is a professional, and she needs to close this chapter properly. First, she must summit K2. And almost as if the mountain heard her promise to quit, the weather suddenly shifts. The relentless storms pause, offering them a glimmer of hope. It looks like one final chance. The remnants of the base camp climbers from different nations who refuse to give up decide to pool their resources. They form a makeshift alliance, a world team, born of desperation and a shared refusal to accept defeat. They are the last ones standing. Among this ragtag group is an American named Rob Slater. He has 0 experience on 8,000-meter peaks, but he compensates with a terrifying, fanatical resolve. He looks at the mountain and utters a phrase that would make any veteran shudder: summit or death, either way I win. It is a mantra that perfectly captures the dangerous all-or-nothing energy of this final push. Alongside Allison and Slater, the group includes seasoned New Zealanders from Peter Hillary's team, the son of the legendary Sir Edmund Hillary, and a robust squad of 4 climbers from Spain. It is important to note this is not a team of friends who trust each other implicitly. They are allies of convenience bound together solely by the desire to tag the summit before the winter snows seal the mountain shut. On August 12th, they haul themselves up to the death zone. They reach Camp 4 perched precariously on the icy shoulder of K2 at an altitude of nearly 8,000 meters. As evening falls before the planned summit push, a strange phenomenon occurs. After months of howling gales, an absolute ringing silence descends upon the mountain. The sky clears completely, revealing a canopy of stars that burn with an intensity only seen at the edge of space. There is no wind, not even a whisper. The mountain seems to be holding its breath. To the climbers, this perfect crystalline weather feels like a divine gift, a reward for their suffering. But in the death zone, such perfection is often a trap. It is a seductive illusion of safety that lulls them into lowering their guard. Inside their fluttering tents, sucking in thin air, they finalize their strategy. They agree to launch the assault together, departing shortly after midnight to maximize daylight for the return trip. The mood shifts to cautious optimism. The months of waiting seem to have paid off. They believe the window has finally opened, and the summit is theirs for the taking. It feels as though the savage mountain has finally decided to grant them passage. They check their oxygen regulators, melt snow for hydration, and force down energy gels. Each climber retreats into their own headspace, but they are united by a singular intoxicating thought: the top is right there. All that remains is one final brutal slog. The night of August 13th arrives. The group emerges from their tents into the freezing dark. Progress is agonizingly slow. At this extreme altitude, every step requires a monumental effort of will. The Spanish team leads the charge, heading out around 1 a.m, with the others trailing behind in a slow-moving chain of headlamps. But the perfect weather that blessed their evening begins to show its first hairline fractures. By midday, as the climbers are navigating the bottleneck, a terrifying couloir of overhanging ice, Peter Hillary stops. He looks up, and what he sees makes his blood run cold. Far above the summit of K, two clouds are beginning to coalesce. These are not innocent wisps of vapor. They are lenticular clouds shaped like saucers, forming a dark cap over the peak. To someone like Hillary, raised on the lore of the Himalayas, the signal is undeniable. It is the classic harbinger of a hurricane-force storm. The window is slamming shut. The mountain is preparing to kill. Hillary makes the gut-wrenching decision to abandon the climb. His survival instinct, sharpened by years of high-altitude experience, is screaming at him to flee. He turns his back on the summit. As he descends, he crosses paths with the climbers still fighting their way up. He meets Allison. Her eyes are wide, burning with a strange, feverish intensity that scares him. Hillary tries to engage her, pointing frantically at the sky at the gathering monster above the peak, but she seems to be in a trance. He would later describe her demeanor with one chilling word: obsessed. She looks right through him, her gaze fixed on the summit that hangs tantalizingly close in the thinning air. In response to his urgent warnings, she offers only a short, steely reply: "I'm going up." That moment marks the final divergence of their fates. Hillary and two others retreat, choosing life over glory. But the remaining six, Allison the fanatical, Rob Slater New Zealander, Bruce Grant, and three Spanish climbers, ignore the signs. They press on, walking directly into a death trap. They cross the invisible line that separates ambition from suicide. They have passed the point of no return. They continue their upward struggle, completely oblivious to the fact that the icy hammer of a massive storm is poised directly above their heads, ready to strike with inhuman fury. They are climbing toward the fulfillment of a lifelong dream, but that dream has morphed into a deadly illusion. They keep pushing step after labored step. But time, the mountaineers' cruelest enemy, is slipping away. The snow is deep and loose, turning the climb into a vertical swim that drains their energy reserves. Their pace slows to a crawl. In high-altitude mountaineering, the turnaround time is sacred. On K2, the rule is simple: if you haven't reached the summit by 2 p.m, you turn back. No exceptions. To push past that time is to gamble that you can descend in the dark before you freeze to death. They break that rule, and the consequences are fatal. They don't reach the summit until 7 p.m. The sun is already dipping toward the horizon, casting long shadows and painting the surrounding peaks in a deep, ominous crimson. Allison and Spanish climber Javier Olivar stand on the second highest point on Earth. It is a hollow victory. Olivar keys his radio one last time to speak to base camp. His voice sounds exhausted but eerily calm. He reports that the weather is still perfect, no wind, just bitter cold. They are starting the descent immediately. Those are the final words the world will ever hear from them. Barely an hour after that radio call, the trap springs instantly. Without a preamble of gusts, a massive wall of wind roars in from the north, sweeping out of China. This is not a standard mountain squall. It is a full-blown hurricane. Winds scream at over 160 kilometers an hour, force enough to lift a grown man off his feet and hurl him into the abyss. Combined with the wind chill, the temperature plunges to levels where human life is extinguished in seconds. The hurricane catches all 6 climbers on the most exposed, defenseless section of the mountain, the summit ridge. There is nowhere to hide, no rock outcroppings, no crevasses, no shelter. They are engulfed by the epicenter of a raging tempest at 8,500 meters, lost in the white fury of the savage mountain. High up at Camp 4, Their shelter amounts to nothing more than thin nylon sheets flapping violently against the screaming wind. To them, safety feels like a concept from a different lifetime, an eternity away from this frozen hellscape. They are utterly exposed, stripped of defenses against a ferocious atmospheric violence they arrogantly thought they could outwait. The mountain's trap hasn't just closed. It has slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid. While chaos reigns at the summit, a separate life-or-death struggle is unfolding thousands of feet below at Camp 2. Two Spanish mountaineers, who had the foresight to turn back earlier, are currently fighting a war of attrition against the elements. Throughout a night that feels endless, battling temperatures that threaten to freeze the blood in their veins, they are forced to use their own bodies as anchors. With bare, frost-nipped hands, they physically hold their tent walls together from the inside, desperate to keep the hurricane-force winds from shredding the fabric and blasting them off the face of the cliff into the black void. Against all odds, they endure the night. As the sun creeps over the horizon on August 14th, the storm finally exhales, losing its lethal intensity. Battered but alive, the Spaniards begin their retreat down the mountain, their minds solely focused on descent. They have absolutely no concept of the horror that has unfolded in the death zone above them, nor do they know that their friends are no longer fighting for survival. They are already gone. Fate has appointed these survivors to be the bearers of grim news, the first witnesses to the catastrophe. Lorenzo Ortiz, one of the Spanish climbers, navigates the treacherous slope, his eyes scanning the route for safe footing. Suddenly, his heart stops. He stumbles upon a debris field that shouldn't be there. Scattered across the pristine, blinding white snow like tragic confetti are personal belongings, objects that have no business being separated from their owners. His gaze locks onto a flash of color, a purple anorak featuring a distinctive floral pattern. Then he sees a lone climbing boot and a safety harness lying unattached. Recognition hits him like a physical blow. These items belong to Allison. The jacket isn't just discarded, it is marred with dark, ominous stains that look unmistakably like dried blood. Ortiz tilts his head back, scanning the terrain above, and spots 3 parallel gouges carved deep into the snow, leading straight down into the bottomless abyss. These are the undeniable forensic signatures of a fall. The way her equipment is strewn across the mountain face, separated by hundreds of meters, communicates a horrific truth to the experienced climber. This wasn't a slip, it was a violent ejection. She was torn from the mountain face and plummeted over a kilometer. The velocity and the force of the wind were so extreme that the elements literally stripped the clothing and gear from her body as she tumbled through the air, operating on adrenaline and shock. Ortiz forces his exhausted body to continue the descent, but then he paralyzed again. Far below his position near the vicinity of Camp 3, he distinguishes a static shape resting on the ice. It is a human form clad in a bright red jumpsuit, the signature color Allison wore. The distance is too great, and his energy reserves are completely depleted. He knows that trying to reach the body would be a suicide mission. All he can do is stand there, a silent witness staring at that tiny splash of crimson against the infinite white desolation. The reality sets in. None of the 6 climbers who pushed for the summit made it back to the safety of the tents. Every single one of them remained in the death zone. Aside from that single distant visual confirmation, the mountains swallowed them whole. No other bodies were ever recovered. They simply vanished into the ice. The savage mountain had collected its toll, leaving behind only a few scattered artifacts as a silent memorial to the devastation. The narrative of Allison Hargreaves, arguably the most talented female mountaineer of her generation, concluded exactly where destiny seemed to have placed it, at the roof of the world. She died embraced by the very peaks she worshipped with such a desperate, consuming love. When word of the disaster on K2 finally reaches the United Kingdom, the reaction is not one of universal mourning. Instead, a strange and cruel transformation takes place in the public discourse. The woman who was hailed as the hero of Everest only a few months prior is suddenly dragged into the court of public opinion. The celebration of her life is cut short, replaced by a vicious inquest. The ink has scarcely dried on the tragic headlines before the media narrative turns toxic. The coverage becomes acidic, judgmental, and deeply personal. A posthumous trial is convened in the columns of the nation's papers, with the central accusation plastered across the front pages of prestigious broadsheets like The Times and The Guardian. The debate centers on a single inflammatory question: does a mother with 2 small children have the moral right to engage in such high-risk endeavors? The prosecution in this media trial is relentless. Nigella Lawson: A high-profile journalist pens a brutal critique describing Hargreaves' choices as unbecoming and condemning her for a level of egoism that she claims denies reality, painting Allison as a woman who chose glory over maternal duty. The condemnation escalates further with Polly Toynbee, who doesn't mince words explicitly branding the fallen climber an unfit mother. In the eyes of the press, Allison is stripped of her athletic achievements and recast as a symbol of recklessness, a selfish figure who effectively traded the well-being of her own children for the dopamine rush of adrenaline and the fleeting applause of fame. Yet amidst this deafening chorus of disapproval, there is a glaring silence regarding one uncomfortable fact. Allison was not alone on that mountain. There were men who died alongside her. These men were fathers. They were husbands. They had families and children eagerly awaiting their return, and yet not a single headline labeled them bad fathers or questioned their morality. No one accused these men of abandoning their offspring for a selfish pursuit. Society adjudicated Allison's life and death by a rigid, hypocritical double standard, readily forgiving men for taking the exact same risks that they deemed unforgivable in a woman. But the actual truth, the driving force behind her fatal climb, remained buried beneath the sensationalism and the noise. It is only much later, when investigative journalists actually bother to scratch beneath the surface, that the heartbreaking reality of her risk-taking comes to light. The narrative wasn't about ego, it was about survival. Details of her bankruptcy surfaced, along with the crushing weight of her debts and the fact that she was living out of a van. It became painfully clear that her expeditions were driven by necessity, not just ambition. Climbing was not a hobby. It was a desperate business strategy. The currency she was trading was her own life, and the stakes were nothing less than her children's financial future. Behind the caricature of the bad mother stood a woman backed into a corner, realizing that conquering the world's highest peaks was the only marketable skill she possessed to put food on the table. However, the tragedy does not conclude with her death. The story goes dormant for 2 decades, only to reemerge with a chilling mirror image twist. The little boy who once played with toy trucks at the Everest base camp while his mother climbed Tom Ballard grows into a man, and in a turn of fate that feels almost scripted, he chooses to walk the exact same precarious path. The very mountains that stole his mother become the center of his universe, his passion, and his profession. He evolves into one of the most gifted alpinists of his era. In the year 2015, he stuns the global climbing community by replicating his mother's most famous achievement, soloing the 6 great north faces of the Alps in a single season. But Tom pushes the envelope even further than she did. He completes this monumental task during the winter season significantly, increasing the difficulty and danger. He explicitly dedicates this superhuman feat to her memory. It is the ultimate act of a son finishing his mother's work, surpassing her benchmarks while paying the highest possible tribute to her legacy. It appears he had discovered a unique way to communicate with her, utilizing the only language that made sense to them both, the unforgiving language of high altitude. But the mountains are patient hunters. They know how to wait. In the winter of 2019, at the age of 30, Tom packs his gear and heads to Pakistan. He returns to the very same mountain range where his mother vanished. His objective is Nanga Parbat, another peak that carries the moniker the Killer Mountain. He isn't just climbing it, he is attempting a never-before-completed route, the legendary Mummery Spur, alongside his climbing partner from Italy, Daniele Nardi. On February 24, 2019, the radio goes silent. Contact is lost. What follows is a long, agonizing search and rescue operation that captivates the world. Viewers across the globe hold their breath, hoping for a miracle that never comes. Days later, a high-powered telescope sweeps the face of the mountain and reveals the heartbreaking truth. 2 minuscule specks are identified on a snow-swept slope. They are motionless. They will remain there for eternity, claiming their place as part of the mountain. The narrative arc completes a perfect, devastating circle. Allison Hargreaves perished at the age of 33. Her son, Tom Ballard, perished at 30. Both lives were extinguished in the icy grip of Pakistan's 8,000-meter peaks. This feels like more than just a tragic coincidence. It resembles a fatal inheritance, a haunting saga of love and obsession passed down through the bloodline leading both mother and son to the exact same destination, a frozen eternity at the top of the world. So I have to ask, what are your thoughts on this generational saga? How do you interpret the choices made by Allison Hargreaves? Do you see a mother making the ultimate sacrifice to provide for her family? Or do you believe the critics were right about the dangers she courted?